Hi, it's counselor and educator Dr. Greg Jantz. We do hear the term trauma bond. What does that really mean? We're going to jump into trauma bond here next on Hope and Possibility.
Dr. Gregory Jantz is a best-selling author of over 45 books and the founder of the Center A Place of Hope, voted a top 10 center for depression treatment in the U.S. As the pioneer of whole person care, Dr. Jantz is known as the messenger of hope. Now the nation's expert on anxiety, depression, substance abuse, relationships, trauma, and PTSD, here is Dr. Gregory Jantz.
Hi, it's Dr. Greg Jantz. As a counselor, and now for 40 years, here at the Center A Place of Hope, I can tell you the word trauma can trigger so many thoughts, so many images. The word trauma is powerful and packed really with a lot of emotion. It is the number one issue that we are seeing right now. Individuals seeking help, and they're asking for, I need help for my trauma. Yes, there's anxiety. Yes, there's depression and addiction. But trauma, in the last 2 years, the request for help for trauma has skyrocketed. And I wrote a book called Triumph Over Trauma. How do you triumph over trauma? What is trauma and what is a trauma bond? I've got some really important notes here that really outlines what we need to do today. And I'm going to be going fast. I respect time, and it's always an honor when somebody sits down and listens to information I provide. And so I want you to know a trauma bond is this. It is something, first of all, that, again, can bring a lot of emotion. We can be feeling like we're doing okay, and then somebody starts talking about trauma or a trauma bond, and then you just feel like, man, I'm losing it. Something's going on inside me that's really difficult. A trauma bond is this. I made a note. It's a strong emotional connection. It develops between people who have shared an intense, emotional, and generally pretty painful experience. It is an emotional connection, not necessarily a positive one, but it is an emotional connection that gets confusing. So I've had intense pain. It's been emotional, and maybe it's been a person who's abused me physically, sexually, emotionally. There's emotional abuse. And here I am. I'm at a place where I'm almost overly identifying with the abuser. There is an unhealthy bond, an unhealthy connection. And so it comes by different words. Sometimes there's what we say, or people may say, traumatic bonds. But here's how it happens. It's generally through a repetitive cycle of abuse. It's not usually a one-time event, although that could be a one-time event where, let's say, it's sexual abuse. Yes. Trauma. Yes, significant. A trauma bond tends to develop when that's repetitive, and it can be mistreatment in various forms, like emotional abuse, over and over and over and over. And it may seem like in a relationship, everything's okay. You think it's all over with, and then boom, there's the trauma again. Something happens. So it's just consistent over time, but it may not be all the time. A trauma bond is, and I'm going to use the word victim because a person gets victimized. There's a perpetrator and there's a victim. And a dominant person, power and control, and a person that is under that power and control. And so there's generally this power differential from the abuser and the person who's the victim of that abuse. Now, I don't believe you're always a victim, so I'm going to be really clear about that. But it's power and over you, and you become connected to that person. Brain chemistry's changed. Emotions get really confusing. And there could be, happens in different contexts, there could be a romantic relationship where there's been trauma and probably not healthy. But because it's a romantic relationship, you go back and back to that trauma. It's a person that could be mistreated. Let's say they're mistreated sexually, and but there's feelings and fit under the category of romantic, or we're together. Now I'm obligated. And so there is a sexual connection many times, though it's greatly unhealthy and it's very abusive, and it is power over you. So that's a trauma bond. Trauma bonds can come parent-child relationships when things are unhealthy. Now, let's put it in the workplace for a minute. There can be trauma bonds in a abusive, harassment, a environment that's hostile, in a work environment, and it gets quite traumatic because now there's a dependency on my job, and I have the power. There's power and authority over me, generally, and it's traumatic, and I have to be a certain way in order to maintain my job. All right. I know it's a difficult topic, and I could go on and on with stories and examples, but I want you to have the core information that's important to have, because if there's a trauma bond in your life, and it creates confusion in relationships, it creates an environment where you just don't know who to trust. So you may go back to that abuser, and that's number one. You can develop a dependency on the abuser. And it's an emotional dependence. They're over me, there's power and control, and I really do end up becoming dependent upon them kind of for everything, even for my value. I know that I'm being mistreated. I know that it's abusive. I don't know what other option I have. I feel like I can't get out from that, and so I stay in that situation. The dependency, maybe I feel like I need to have validation, I need to have approval from this person, and I get both approval and I get abuse. Now, the person doing this, it could fit under the narcissistic personality disorder. You could be victimized by a narcissistic personality. Remember, power and control, abuse is in there. And it just whittles down your self-esteem and causes you to feel like you are a nobody. So that's one, dependence that develops on the abuser. Number two, I wrote down cycles of abuse and kindness. This is so confusing. One minute you feel extremely loved by this person, and it feels like everything is okay. And then in the next period of time, it's not love. In the next period of time, it is truly abuse. Maybe it's emotional abuse, name calling, comparisons, silent treatment, rage or anger that is out of control, but maybe you're never touched, so it's emotional abuse. So that is cycles of abuse and kindness. Look for that. That does create trauma bonds. Number three, you will be isolated from all your support systems. And so there's a reliance on this one person, an incredibly unhealthy reliance, but it's there. And you get isolated from family, friends, those that are traditionally support systems. They may want to try to control who you see and so forth, and manipulate all of your relationships. That's very common. And then the next one is intense emotional connection. Trauma bonds, as odd as it sounds, create a very intense interwoven bond. And I'm going to say, because we use the whole person approach, emotionally, spiritually, physically, we're going to look at the whole person. There can be spiritual abuse that is so strong, or there could be a misuse of like the scriptures to control another person. It's a trauma bond, but you are so connected And eventually we give over all of our thoughts, all of our obedience over to the person that we see as superior. Though part of it knows this is really wrong, but you can see no escape route out. So intense connections. Think of it this way. The more intense the trauma is, the more intense the bond is. Abusers and victims do bond with one another in an extremely unhealthy way, but there is a strong interhook and the victim sees no way out of this. They see no way out of it. Okay, the next one is difficulty breaking free. There's like no way out of this. And when you're in this situation, and there's been a trauma bond, you do not see your way out. You can't see options. And there's fear is great. Anxiety is huge. Probably sleep issues are manifesting. You may have a secret addiction. Could be alcohol, misuse of prescription drugs, whatever. But you are doing something right now that to cope, because you're so afraid and you can't break free. It's usually a significant crisis or somebody else in your life that sees what's going on and they throw a life ring to you to save you. All right. The next one is self-blame and shame. Well, what's that look like? Self-blame and shame. Shame is I'm defective. Something's wrong with me, and it is all my fault. I'm defective, something wrong with me, and it is all my fault. All my fault. And you internalize this as though it is true. All right, one more. We're going to be doing this in two parts. Trauma bond it's a big topic, and if it fits for you or a loved one, there is a lot here that can feel overwhelming. But the self-blame, you will eventually say in the trauma bond, it's all my fault. I deserve this. There's no way out. That's what my destiny is. And you live that way. The next one is, and final one for right now, you repeat this over and over in other relationships. Let's say you break free. It's challenging and difficult. But then the next relationship you step into is another familiar one that is a repetitive cycle of what you have just experienced. Not that you consciously said, I'm going to go out and do this and find another abuser and have more trauma in my life. No, it's not that. But it's what you know, and you step right back into those patterns, and it just really perpetuates a cycle of abuse in your life. More and more trauma bonds. All right, part 2, we do these in smaller segments. It's important information. Triumph Over Trauma and the related workbook is a resource, and the goal is, if I have significant trauma in my life, I'm not going to do this on my own. I can read a great book like the one I wrote, but you have to have skilled hands and wisdom. And I'm going to say, from my vantage point, prayer and intercession into my life, so that I can even see that I have a future and I have hope in my life, because trauma bonds create apathy, dependency, and despondency, where I feel very despondent about my future. All right, part 2 is next, around the corner. There is hope.